Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Fredrik Logevall. Fred is the Laurence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs at the JFK School of Government and Professor of History at Harvard University. His specialty is on U.S. foreign relations history and also modern international history. He's won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2013, and he is the author of the first volume of, to be 2 volumes. The book that's out is called JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956, which is volume 1, and volume 2 is what he is currently writing at the moment. We talk about this book, the first volume. We start out by talking about why telling JFK's story is important for America's story and how he links those two together. We talk about the essential aspects of Irish immigrants moving to New England at various points. We talk about how the Kennedy family gravitated to politics shortly after immigrating from Ireland. We talk about the familial, national, and global context in which Jack grew up. We talk about the major characteristics of Jack's psychological profile. We talk about the importance of his friendship with Len when they were at Choked. We talk about JFK's immense foreign affairs experiences, why he decided to enter the U.S. House of Representatives, his pretty spectacular Senate campaign, and why he chose to be a running mate in 56. And then Fred gives us a kind of preview of what's to come in the volume 2 that he's writing, which covers the last 7 years of JFK's life. As we mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, we talk about how there is not that many kind of 1 or 2 volume authoritative biographies, at least recently, on JFK, which is pretty interesting considering how people, love JFK and he's well revered. And, Fred just does an absolute stand-up job, just knockout job of talking about JFK, writing about JFK. His biography is, just spectacular. I remember I got to the end of volume 1 and I said, I want it more. How many years do I have to wait until volume 2? And so Fred is hard at work on it, and I cannot wait for that volume. And I'm very proud of the conversation we had, and hopefully it can be a really, really good kind of snapshot of JFK's early part of his life. And so now I bring you Fredrik Logevall. I'm here with Fredrik Logevall. Fred, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's a big honor. I'm very excited to talk to you about your book. So thanks for coming on.
Well, it's so good to have you. Good of you to have me on, and I look forward to our chat.
Yeah, me as well. So we were talking just before we got on here. You have written a volume 1, soon to be of 2 books on John F. Kennedy, our 35th president of the United States. The book is called JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917 to 1956. And as we were chatting, not a lot of really serious authoritative biographies on JFK, which is interesting. You would think someone that was so popular, someone that was so well loved and revered, and globally, that there would be more written on him. Especially, 60, 70 years now from his death. And so I guess the first question is why did you decide to tackle a kind of enigmatic person, someone that's well loved, but not a lot written on?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about this. I mean, it's a puzzle to me, frankly, Xavier, that we don't have more in-depth books on this man, this iconic figure in 20th century history, not just U.S. history, but I would say world history. Very consequential figure, and about whom people have a lot of opinions, and yet, though we have thousands of books on him, literally, and on the family, some of them very good, I hasten to add, we don't have a lot of what we would call comprehensive biographies, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing this. I decided, I don't see the kind of treatment that I want to give this figure. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book, maybe we can talk about this, is to tell the story of him, certainly one of the remarkable American, arguably the great American story. So tell the story of him and his life, tragically cut short, of course, in November of 1963. But I'm also trying to tell the story of America and of the world, even in terms of at least diplomacy and statecraft, foreign policy in his life. And so it's been a challenge. It's been fun. And we'll see how it turns out in these 2 volumes.
Yeah, well, the first one is magnificent. So, I mean, everyone should definitely read it. It was very illuminating for me, about someone that's talked about a lot, the family that's talked about a lot, but not really is known in many aspects. And so you definitely have accomplished it, at least in volume 1. And so much anticipation for volume 2. The place, I guess, to start is kind of at the beginning. And I guess just kind of a backdrop here is, so for folks that don't know, obviously, is that the Kennedys, their family is Irish, and they came from Ireland. And that was a common thing that happened. There was waves of immigration in the United States. And what, I guess, for that initial wave, was it for the United States, aside from land of opportunity and things? Was it just the potato famine? Was it, certain conflicts? What was the major factors for many Irish folks coming to the United States in that massive wave of immigration?
Well, certainly in that wave, the potato famine was absolutely critical. There had been plenty of Irish immigrants before, and of course they would continue after. Yeah. And many of them settled in New England. So this part of the country where I am now, I'm in Cambridge, certainly had waves of Irish immigrants. But for this particular clan, the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds, I think the potato famine was of immense importance. You ended up losing, in terms of the population, either through emigration, excuse me, or death, a very sizable percentage of the Irish population, and because there were already a lot of Irish in America, it makes sense, I suppose, that people who were looking to get away from this terrible situation would look in the first instance to the States, as they called it. And they might have relatives there, they might have close relatives, they might have friends. And so along the Eastern Seaboard in particular, New York most of all, but also Boston, Philly, Baltimore, other cities, they came in really large numbers, and that includes, the ancestors of JFK.
Early on, you talk about it in the book, is where there's this pull almost, so how I see it, is that for the Kennedys, I think particularly JFK's grandfather, to become involved in politics. So they're in and around the Boston area, and they start to become involved within the community there, and they become involved politically. Was this something that's just hardwired in the family to just get involved in that way? Or what was it that you think was motivating to get involved in politics?
It's such a good question. I love it. And I think, you could look at sort of the particular situation, meaning the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds, that you have a group of people who are both talented, they're driven, they're ambitious. There's a certain legendary Kennedy energy that they had, and they could go all day long. Combine that with a broader phenomenon, which is that many Irish Catholics, certainly in Boston, found that various avenues were closed to them. So the financial community, and I write about this, was to a considerable extent closed to them. Other opportunities they might wish to pursue, there was discrimination. But politics, from a relatively early point, not right away, but from a relatively early point, they found that they were both interested in politics, they were good at politics. It was an opportunity for for strivers, and they certainly were in this family, these families, for opportunity for strivers to make their mark. And so politics became a choice for several of them. And I don't think it's coincidental, Xavier, that young Jack Kennedy, when he is at the knee of his grandfather, both grandfathers actually, on his mother's side and his father's side, and accompanies them, and in particular his mother's father, the legendary Honey Fitzgerald. Young Jack and his older brother Joe Jr. accompany their grandfather on, campaign events. They see politics up close from a very early age. I don't think it's coincidental that they both developed this interest in politics, and then they ultimately choose, or certainly in the case of Jack, Joe, of course, is killed in the war. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. But Jack pursues politics as a career for himself. It makes good sense, I think.
Yeah, it's a twofold here. Is that comes through in the book, is that there's this sort of, I mean, how do I say born into it, right? But there's a backdrop. There's a context of politics is kind of around always the family, right? You're talking, 2 or 3 generations there when you get to Jack, and then subsequently. And so it's one of those things where I can imagine it was a kind of familiar territory contextually for Jack, even though, I think you write in the book, he wasn't necessarily, you see this with some presidents or some politicians, they kind of have this like, proclivity, right? They're just, as a kid, everyone's like, yes, that person's going to be on the Supreme Court. They're going to be president. Doesn't seem like he was necessarily trying to do that. It was just kind of the background. And then, I think as we'll get into it, when he decided to run for political office, it was a kind of natural talent almost. He was quite good at it. So
I think that's right. And after the fact, in hindsight, and this is the danger of hindsight, is that we see these signs. We see the evidence that he was destined to be a political figure or even president. And of course, that's a real danger for biographers, is that we see evidence in this or that, high school paper or college paper, a future president. And of course, as you point out, it doesn't work that way. And I think even less maybe than some politicians. He showed those signs from an early age. I do think it's fair to say that he was interested in politics, and maybe especially in foreign policy from a young age. And he enjoyed accompanying his grandfather on campaign events. We should also note that his mother, who's often slighted in the literature, that is to say, Rose Kennedy, Rose had a deep interest in politics. And she loved everything about it. She liked the pageantry of politics, the events, the confetti, the bands. And she also liked the kind of backroom strategizing in politics. And I think she passed some of that on to not just Jack, but to others in the family. Many of her kids came to have that same, if not passion for it, certainly interest in it. And I think she had it more than Joe had, her husband. Even though he had political ambitions himself, I think the love of politics came much more from Rose.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, as you will talk about later, is that there's been made about, the influence of his dad, how he was such a towering figure. He's very influential. He's a very powerful figure. How much of his aspirations was in Jack to become president. But you kind of sort of dispel that. Not that he wasn't an important figure, obviously, for Jack, but that it was really him that wanted to do many of these aspirations, and also that there's a backdrop, there's a context in which he's coming out of. It's not just, he couldn't do some of these things, so he puts it into his son or one of them. It really was kind of a whole batch of ingredients there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I hope that comes through in the book. His father was, a towering figure. He was deeply influential in the lives of his kids, including Jack. Jack was very devoted to him. But this is one of the things that I found totally fascinating in the research. As you say, Jack made his own decisions about what he was going to pursue, why he was going to pursue it. And his father, to his great credit, and Joe Kennedy is a complicated figure, but I think he never, with any of the kids, said, I'm the boss. This is what you're going to do for a career, and this is why you're doing it. He never really said that. Sure, when Joe Jr. was killed in the war, he did, I think, pressure Jack to take his place, if you will, and to pursue politics. But ultimately, I think Jack Kennedy did that for his own reasons. And I think his father's encouragement helped, no question. But it grows out of Jack Kennedy's own studies, including here at Harvard, his World War II experience, which I'm sure we'll talk about, his own sense that the United States is now going to be first among equals on the world stage. Maybe I can contribute to the making of politics and the making of statecraft in particular. I think it's that more than his old man that's driving this.
No, it definitely comes through, and to that end, much as you said at the top, is it's a story about Jack, but it's also about kind of the world in which he was living in, and the context in which he kind of 1917 is at the tail end of World War One, and so you talk about this. He comes into the world as a young boy. World War One is right in the rearview mirror. You have the Spanish flu that's there, the women's right to vote, the Roaring Twenties, all of these things, and you see that the Kennedys, especially the dad, becomes very wealthy very fast and so young. So all of these things are kind of there. So just in the context as he gets older, is there's a big backdrop of FDR, obviously because of his dad's affiliation with him. But in the early parts of it, that also is kind of building there of the world stage where the United States was, how we interact with war and social issues and things like that. So you just say just a little bit of kind of the world backdrop at the time when he's a child, and then also as the family became wealthy as he started to get older.
Yeah, I mean, I think this context that you're describing, Xavier, is, I think, to me, completely, it's so interesting. And he's born 1917, as you say, just as the US is entering the war. It's kind of a great power, the United States, but not, I would say, a full-fledged member of the great power club. It's kind of in the wings, if you will. So that's what, and he's too young to, of course, know anything about this, but that's when he's born. And by the time he dies in 1963, it's the United States is the greatest power the world has ever known. So part of what this 2-volume project is attempting to do is to chart that extraordinary rise. I guess you could say the rise of Kennedy himself, because that's extraordinary. But alongside that, the country. And I think you're right that those early years, the U.S. is arguably critical to the success for the Western powers in the war. 1918, Woodrow Wilson is the leading, international statesman. And then in the 20s, the United States grows fantastically in terms of its economic wealth. Joe Kennedy is a beneficiary of that. He becomes, as you say, phenomenally wealthy. They become one of the richest families in America, actually. And Jack Kennedy is a little kid, and he's seeing all of this, and he's ingesting this, and he becomes really interested in history, in reading about great leaders. I write about that in the book. He's in prep school, and maybe even before that, he's reading about these people. And meanwhile, the United States is growing immensely in its power, and his father becomes ultimately ambassador to Britain. It's a remarkable story.
Well, again, going back to the beginning, I mean, 2-3 generations beforehand, they were in Ireland, and they were immigrants here. It's just the fact that how fast that happened, which is interesting again because of how also the country was, rapidly rising as well. So it is a really nice kind of juxtaposition of.
I think it really is, and of course, Joe Kennedy, the father, liked to imply that he came from, no means whatsoever, or that he was from a kind of disadvantaged background. It's not really true in the sense that his father had already begun to become an important player in Boston and in Boston politics. Was a successful businessman, nothing like Joe Kennedy, became. But I think you're absolutely right to point out that this is a group, the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds, that really arrived in this country with nothing. And then over really a couple of generations, 2.5, let's say, became incredibly wealthy and successful, and yet always along the way experienced discrimination. So even after Joe Kennedy becomes super rich, he feels aggrieved. He has resentments, which I write about, and I think which on some level at least filter down to the children below him. It's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition.
Yeah. There's a few kind of prongs here. I kind of want to, you can approach them however way you want, but that is a thread here, because what I'm interested in is somewhat the psychological profile here of Kennedy early on in his kind of formative years, and then how the family contributes to that. And there's basically a few lines that run through here. So one of them is the very deep Catholicism they had, which they were discriminated against for that, even all the way up until he was nominee for president. It was just like, he's going to be a mouthpiece for the Pope and all this stuff, which is a little footnote here. So everyone made a big to-do, obviously, about the first president to be, Catholic, et cetera, right? Which was a big thing and all that at the time. I did not realize till recently that he and Joe Biden are, to this day, the only two presidents that are Catholic, at least practicing Catholics. I did not recognize, again, there's millions of Catholics in the United States. It's so astounding to me how, Kennedy was the first in 1960, and then here we are, Joe Biden, in 2020, 60 years later, whatever it is. And it's insane that, I don't know. It's just a weird kind of thing that you would think there would be more, at least of sorts. And that's how it falls out, but it's in a weird footnote.
And it's just on that weird footnote. It's interesting that in this last election, it was certainly talked about, but that it got much less attention. And I think we should be grateful for that. When it was Joe Biden running, and lots of articles. If you did a Google search, you'd find all kinds of articles, but nevertheless, nothing like what Kennedy experienced in 60. And I'm writing about this right now, by the way, Xavier, in terms of volume 2, looking at this closely and looking at the question of whether his Catholicism helped him in 1960. It certainly did in some states.
Sure.
It hurt him in other states. But what's the overall conclusion that we should draw from that? But as you say, these are the only two guys who have been Catholics and been elected. Al Smith had been put up in 1928, was not successful. And that was one reason why for, a couple decades thereafter, 3 decades thereafter, Democrats and Republicans were fearful about putting up another Catholic, and why Kennedy had to fight through this. And by the way, including among some Catholics, there were Catholics in 60, including Catholic politicians who were leery of putting up a Catholic at the top of the ticket. Really interesting story.
Yeah, and I think even to this day, the most kind of rumblings I heard about anything with Biden being Catholic was from other Catholics, at least some of the articles I read. I would just say, just on that, is my suspicion is that as we've become more maybe cosmopolitan or more progressive or whatever as a country in some aspects, maybe socially, you look at the most recent Pew Research. There's more secular humanists and people that are non-religious now than at any point in the United States history, at least actively stating as such. That has always been the case, but that people are going to identify with no religion or whatever. And so I wonder if over the past 60 years and modernity and things like that, that's maybe a contributor for why, and maybe a little bit of Biden's age. He's just been around. It's not like it's a new thing. People know he's been Catholic for, since he's been in politics for 50 years.
I think that last point, I think I agree with your take. I think that last point, which I haven't really heard discussed very much, but I think you're onto something there, that he's such a known quantity and has been in Washington for such a large period of his life, more than half a century, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Had been vice president for 2 terms under Obama. I mean, people know this guy.
Yeah.
Maybe a different candidate, a new candidate. Maybe there would be more scrutiny. But I think your broader point is correct about where the country is now vis-a-vis 20 years ago, 40 years ago, certainly 60 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Catholicism thing was huge for him and his family.
Yeah.
Even though they were wealthy, you describe how his parents were very much about hard work and really emphasizing hard work ethic. And then also you talk about, or there's the third strain here in his early development as a child and adolescence of him being physically ill, having many ailments that went all through his life. And then finally, just kind of about his temperament as this kind of mix of kind of romanticism and idealism. And so you have these 4 kinds of prongs, if you will, that I see are contributing to his, essentially psychological profile: hard work, strong religious affiliation, and what that means kind of with kind of culture and family, his own physical ailments, and then also this emphasis on some of his temperamental things. So just kind of in those kind of 4 ways, how do you understand, or how can we have a clear picture of really the man of who he was as he was developing?
Well, I think you've laid it out pretty well, Xavier. I do think they contribute, and maybe there's a 5th, and then I'll maybe say something more about the ones you've already articulated. But the fifth strand is the one concerning the tragedies that he experienced. So, in addition, for example, to the health ailments, I write about how not only does he lose his brother, who's closest to him, who's the oldest, but the sibling to whom he feels the biggest bond, Kathleen, who is known as Kick. He loses her in a plane crash in 1948, and Rosemary, who's the closest next to him in age, less than a year and a half apart, he effectively loses her to a botched lobotomy in late 1941. So these are the 3 siblings closest to him in age, all gone effectively. Yeah. That I think has an enormous effect on him in terms of, and it would anybody.
Sure.
And we can talk further about that. I think, though, that the strands that you've articulated here, which are central, it's, I think, hard to exaggerate the importance of them. What's interesting about the health one, if we can talk about that for just a second, is that he's sick, or at least not as strong as he should be, pretty much every day of his life, as his brother famously Bobby pointed out at one point. And yet, as I write about in the book, almost because it's an effort to overcome this, he is indefatigable on the campaign trail, and in terms of being a politician. So when he gets into the White House, people talk about the same thing, that he's willing and able to go from early in the morning on the campaign trail till late at night, day after day after day. It's almost as though he's trying to prove to others and maybe to himself that even with all these health problems, I'm not going to let it slow me down. That's an interesting aspect of the health issue. I also speculate in the book that maybe it has an effect. It has the effect of making John F. Kennedy more empathetic, at least to a degree, at least in terms of a kind of cognitive empathy. That is to say, he can put himself into other people's shoes better, more easily, because of both the tragedies at home, but also these health problems than would otherwise be the case. It's a little bit like Franklin Roosevelt and polio. After polio, at least some biographers would say, Roosevelt becomes more empathetic, understanding the variety in the American experience in a way that he hadn't before, because he was, of course, a child of immense privilege. And so the two of them have that interesting connection.
And even with the tragedies piece, is also, it reminds me a lot of Lincoln, right? I'm not necessarily comparing Kennedy and Lincoln, but just in the tragedy aspect, because also Lincoln had his son died, his mother died, his sister died, and again, it was kind of a feature of the times, unfortunately. But I think for Kennedy as well. I mean, having siblings.
I think it would be interesting actually to explore in American history, and maybe beyond the United States, political leaders and their commonality on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just before you split the book into three really nice sections, and towards the end of the first section, you talk about this relationship he had with Lem. Is this the right name, right?
Lem Billings. Yeah.
And there's some, I guess, some interesting commentary on that. So maybe just tell us why this relationship was important to Jack, what it was for Lem that we can say confidently on, and just kind of describe how that was helpful in his formative kind of relationship building, I guess, with other folks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you raised that. I think it's a very important friendship. All of us, or at least most of us, I think, need to have somebody in our lives who can be a kind of bosom buddy. It can be somebody that you can rely on, no questions asked. I think it was that kind of relationship. I think that Jack was always the dominant figure in the relationship. At certain moments, I think he took advantage of Lem, or he understood that he had that kind of power over his friend. But as I also write, the friendship was extremely important to Jack as well. It wasn't just to Lem that this mattered. They met at Choate. Mm-hmm. They were there for prep school and became fast friends and remained close friends really till the end in Dallas. In fact, Jackie used to complain that Lem was kind of an appendage even after the marriage. He was around a lot. She loved Lem, I think, but as any spouse would say, okay, he shouldn't come around quite as much as he does. So I think it's an important relationship. And as I say, for both of them, and I write about how they travel, for example, in Europe, mm-hmm. A remarkable tour in Europe in the mid 1930s. The war clouds are beginning to gather. Hitler is on the scene. They spent time in Germany. They both write home and write in diaries about their experiences. Marvelous resources. And I write about that. But it's also an important moment in their own friendship. You spend a couple months zip around Europe together. Yeah. You form some kind of, I think, bond, or you can, that will be there forever, really. And it certainly was in their case. Billings is somebody he can go to. And again, without any sort of, question. And, the subtext is also that Lem begins to have feelings for Jack that go beyond, platonic friendship. And so I write a little bit about that. There's not that much that we know about this. But I think what's pretty telling, especially for mid-20th century America, is that even after it's clear that Lem Billings is gay, Jack Kennedy accepts him as a friend. And I think Billings talked subsequently, not directly about that, obviously, but he talked about the loyalty that he always felt from Jack as a friend. I do think, as I suggest in the book, that Lem Billings' identity became a little too wrapped up in the Kennedys, not just Jack Kennedy, but the family as a whole. And that's probably not a healthy thing in some respects, but a very important friendship, no question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's as a piece I didn't really know about. And so it was a very interesting dynamic they had. And I do think it was, as you mentioned, friendships and there's certain key relationships that are important for us. Family, yes, parents, siblings, but then also friendships or, spouses or things like that. And he no definitely question. was a big one. One of the things, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but is, I think you can, again, tell me what your thoughts are on this, obviously, but I have to imagine that one of the reasons why Kennedy was elected was because
Mhm.
even though he was the youngest elected president,
Mhm.
he had an immense amount of foreign experience. Immense for his, I mean, it's incredible. It's really incredible. And this kind of starts off, there's this big trip on Normandy, right? Is I think the name of the ship is right?
That's right.
And they go all over Europe during World War II. Right. And so maybe just say how that was really formative for him.
I think it was a very formative time in his life, as you say, and really beginning in some ways with this trip with Lem Billings, which was earlier, and then traveling with his parents and Kik on the Normandy at a critical moment. Then, maybe most important of all, is the experience that JFK has. If you can imagine, this is just sort of amazing. For about 6 months, talk about a study abroad experience. He is tooling around Europe with his father's help. His father, by this point, is ambassador to Britain, so he's able to make connections. Mm-hmm. And Jack travels through European capitals for the roughly 6 months prior to the start of World War II. Mm. So this is the first half, more or less, of 1939. He is a junior at Harvard. What an amazing experience this is. He's coming back then for his senior year, which I think is a very formative period for him, and is able to use that experience that he's had seeing these places to write the senior thesis, which becomes his first book. Mm-hmm. In a sense, sets him on his way. There's no question, Xavier, that the international experience of this young man and his comfort in international environments, his appreciation for the notion of differences in terms of national interest, different conceptions of national interest. Mm-hmm. At this point, when he's 20, 21, 22 years old, it's a remarkable part of the story, and frankly quite fun to write about, partly because we have so much material. He's writing letters. We know of his father's experience as ambassador to Britain, which is in many respects a kind of disastrous experience. But Jack is observing that while this is going on. And then the war begins, obviously, in September of 1939. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's just as you say, it's not like he was backpacking with some friends or something, right? Like his dad's the ambassador to England, and, he's in, right, you're saying all these capitals, and he's with all these dignitaries and all these delegates.
He's a little bit, if I may interrupt, he's a little bit like not too long ago, we watched Forrest Gump, and there's a little bit of the, how Forrest Gump just appears with these presidents and is in the background. Jack Kennedy was a little bit that way, or Zelig, the Woody Allen movie, where, this kid really sees all of this. He's even asked to carry a top secret message from Berlin, from the American embassy in Berlin. This is about 10 days before the war begins. He's asked to carry a message to his father, and the message is the Germans are going to attack Poland. I mean, yeah. And he takes that message back, and of course the Germans do attack Poland. Right. But very few people have had anything like this. I suggest in the book that John Quincy Adams, young man, is maybe the closest thing we have to somebody who was able to observe all of this, before he himself becomes a top political figure. But really unusual.
Yeah, well, and it's also about the timing of it, right? Like, he didn't do this in 1926 or something, right? Like, he did this literally at one of the biggest moments in global history, right? Literally months before World War II is starting. So that also is incredible. I did want to ask about a little bit about his dad being ambassador, and his dad really kind of just, not even rubbing shoulders with FDR. I mean, that was his boss. I mean, he's the spokesperson for FDR in England. He wasn't an ambassador to, some very small island country or something. I mean, it's one of the biggest powers, brushing shoulders with Churchill. I mean, just like world leader stuff. How much of that just kind of, yes, there's the exposure, but it's like, okay, when I when I talk to Dad, he's telling me all of this, what FDR and Churchill and all these guys are saying. I mean, just how much is that just kind of downloaded into him? Because then when we see him, I mean, this will come out, I'm assuming, in volume 2, but how that he just kind of sees foreign affairs later in life. That has to have such a consequential impact.
There's no doubt about it. I loved how you just put it, downloaded into him. That's exactly, I think, that's what's going on. And I think, his father's experience was frustrating in many ways. He was an isolationist, both before the war, after it started, both before U.S. entry into the war, after U.S. entry into the war, after Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. Joe Kennedy is completely largely consistent in saying this is not a war that the United States should be fighting. We should stay out of this thing. One of the remarkable parts of this story, in my view, is that father and son split on this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Jack decides, especially I think in 1939-40, so his senior year, that isolationism is untenable for the United States in the current environment.
Can I ask about Joe's isolationism? Is that a little bit of like, hey, when Wilson was doing this in World War I, was there a little bit of that? Like, hey, this is what worked before. Are we just doing like a sequel to this? Like, let's not get involved. We didn't get involved until 1917 or whatever it was. Let's just not get involved again. Let's just not do this again. Was that kind of Joe's mentality, or was it something else?
I think it was. I think that was a view that many isolationists held. That, we were hoodwinked before. We were told that Wilson and the United States and American entry in 1917 was going to make the world safe for democracy. Everything was going to be, excellent after this, and it didn't happen. Look, here we are again. Mm-hmm. Let's not go down this road again, and let's let the Europeans solve this themselves. I think as some historians have suggested, the name isolationist is a little bit of a misnomer, in that many of the people who held to this view were not opposed to interactions with the world. Right. And in particular, I think with Asia, they wanted, in fact, to have lots of commercial involvement for the United States and other kinds of involvements. But what I think they objected to, and what Joe Kennedy objected to, was the idea that the United States would provide a lot of aid to Britain, in particular, and France before it fell, and even worse, get involved with its own troops. But I think, to go back to your original question here, I think it's a really good one. No question but that Jack Kennedy and his brother Joe were, it was downloaded into them, as you say. They imbibed a lot of this from their father. They were in these circles. They would attend these cocktail parties. They knew, how to wear a tuxedo and how to sort of present at these gatherings in London. This all becomes a learning experience for them, I think, in a really interesting and important way. And I think Jack Kennedy later on feels very comfortable with the intricacies of world affairs, and he's endlessly interested in this stuff. And as you say, this period helps make that happen, no question.
Yeah, it's interesting also because, as you were saying, like there's a divergence here, right? Where Joe Kennedy is the isolationist, and then Jack starts that way, and then he says, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't the way, and changes his mind. How much of that was influenced by his studies with various political theories and philosophies, and then also his own views, his kind of romantic, idealistic, and then world travel? How much of all of this stuff is saying, okay, I don't think you got this right, Dad, or other folks that have that line of thinking, and we should intervene, we should have some involvement? What were the pieces that kind of pushed him to diverge from his dad's thinking?
I think it's a combination of those things, which I guess is an obvious answer, but I really find it hard to kind of distinguish among them. I think in no particular order, I guess I would say the following. His professors at Harvard, influenced him.
Hmm.
The student body at Harvard was vociferously isolationist, but the professors were a little different. The professors were more interventionist. He took many of these professors. I think was influenced them as undergraduates sometimes are, often are. They're influenced by what the professors say. So it was partly that. I think, as you pointed out, his own travels made him understand in a way that he hadn't before that the world is complex, that there are these competing conceptions of national interest, and that the United States, by virtue of its economic growth, its geographic position, which is a very favorable geographic position, is going to be a very important player in all of this. And because the Nazis are seeming to run roughshod over, continental Europe, and England might be next, we've got to be prepared for this. But it's not just because Joe Kennedy was, I think, for preparedness. Jack takes that extra step and he says, no, we've also got to be prepared, certainly to assist the British in particular, but we might be getting into this thing ourselves. And here it's also interesting to compare the two brothers because Joe Jr. remains very wedded to his father's position right to the end, even after he volunteers, even if after he enters the war himself. I think until his death in 1944, he is very tied to the father's basic position. Jack is not. So it's about his own travels. It's about the changing world situation. It's about his professors at Harvard. It's about the reading that he's doing, probably something of his own sensibility as well, that he's just more interested, I think, than Joe Jr. is in diplomacy and statecraft and reading about great leaders. And he is a kind of young acolyte, even you would say, of Winston Churchill, and sees Churchill as a kind of model almost for something that he might at some point become himself.
Yeah. I want to talk to him about Jack in the war, but before I do, I want to zoom out just real quick with a footnote again on just kind of a kind of an overview on this point, because and you can correct me along the way if I get this wrong, but so if you have United States becomes independent 1776, we almost don't make it to 100 years with the Civil War. So in this whole time, we're not a world power, right? We're still like the new kid on the block. We're trying to establish ourselves. Okay, we have that. We get over to the Civil War. We do Reconstruction, etc. And it was McKinley who, has, again, some contemporary people will obviously, say some pretty harsh things about him, and maybe some of that's fair and some of it isn't. But at the time, there was this push in the 20th century, right at the turn of the century, of this expansionism. How do we become a world power? How do we become a big player here? And so you have this time of like, kind of take it, I guess, with, the turn of the 20th century, with Teddy Roosevelt, and then you get all the way to Franklin Roosevelt. You have 40 years of the United States seemingly trying to say, how can we prove we deserve to be on the world stage and we can be a force to be reckoned with? And in many ways, I wonder the influence of Churchill, the influence of maybe FDR and maybe others of saying, yes, how do we try to make our stand here or make our mark? And if any of that was, because Kennedy was a great student of history, if any of that was kind of in the mix there of saying, this is the moment kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think what I think historians would say, many of them, myself, I certainly would say this, and probably JFK would say this, is that for at least some part of that period that you describe, say the first 4 decades roughly of the 20th century, the United States is punching below its weight. That the U.S. comes out of World War I with the expectation on the part of lots of international observers that this is now the American age, that the Americans, for lots of reasons, are going to be the dominant power, and then it doesn't happen. That U.S. administrations opt in a sense to not withdraw, but not be the kind of force in international affairs, economic, political, military, that America's inherent power would have allowed them to be. And I think what Roosevelt realizes, I write about this in the book, he gradually comes to the view that, well, this is no longer going to work, that we have to become much more engaged here, that we have to be a leading player. And if we're going to have a role in shaping the post-war peace, whenever that comes, we also have to be really at the center of the action. I think he comes to that view probably somewhat before Jack Kennedy does, although historians dispute, obviously where Roosevelt was when on this story. Is he ahead of public opinion? Is he having to be kind of dragged by elite public opinion? That's a source of controversy among historians, but he certainly gets there.
Sure.
And so does JFK. His father does not, as we've been saying. Mm-hmm. His brother does not, as we've been saying. Jack does.
Yeah, that's just super fascinating. So tell us about his involvement in the war. So he joins the Navy and he's shipped off to war in the South Pacific. Is that right? Yeah. And he, just what was the motivation for doing that? Was it like many people, they wanted to be a part of this, they wanted to fight and all this stuff, or, and then you can tell us about him getting thrown overboard.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a kind of stunning chapter. His actual experience, which I talk about, which is a chapter in the book. Look, I think like many young people, young men in particular, I guess, in that age, I think he saw that if the country is going to war, if we're really going to be fighting either the Japanese or the Germans or both, I need to be a part of this. I certainly need to offer myself up for this great campaign. And I think he did. I write about it. And he could have had, with his father's help, in fact, this was his father's preference, he could have had a nice desk job. Because of his health ailments, because of his father's connections. He could have spent the war in Washington or somewhere else, doing important work, but it's not frontline stuff. But he was determined to see action. Again, here I would give Joe Kennedy credit, because I think his father actually helps him to get in to combat, even though he's deathly afraid that his sons will be killed as a result, that he's going to lose either Joe Jr. or Jack. Depending on how long the war lasts, maybe he'll lose Bobby. Mm-hmm. So his father helps him here in ways that I describe in the book. I think, and then he has the experience in the Solomons, in the South Pacific. I think the war experience for Jack Kennedy has two effects. They're kind of contradictory, but they're both there. Arguably contradictory. First, I think he comes out of the war skeptical about the utility of military force. It doesn't make him a pacifist. He's never that. He understands the importance of having a formidable military. And later on in the Cold War, this is obviously something he endorses. But I think he's like many fighting men who see up close what their superiors are doing. I think he has real misgivings. And you see it in the letters home from the South Pacific about the decisions that are being made. And I think that's something he'll have to the end of his days. I'm going to write about this in volume 2. The second conclusion he draws is that henceforth, from now on, the United States is going to have to be absolutely critical, as we've been discussing, to world affairs. That the United States cannot do what Jack Kennedy thought it had done after World War I, which was to withdraw to a certain degree. No, this is going to be a different world, and the United States is going to be the most important player. And so I think he comes back with that conviction as well. And maybe there's a third conclusion here, which is that maybe I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, can have some role in shaping this future. This is when he's thinking about, what am I going to do next? And after Joe Jr. is killed, I think he's still thinking, maybe I should go into journalism, because he did that at the end of the war. Maybe I should go into academia. Business has no interest in it for him whatsoever, even though his father had made a fortune on Wall Street. Jack Kennedy had no interest in that. But I think whether he goes into politics or not, I think he wonders if he can play a role in some way in this new world that the globe is going to, that humanity is going to have after the war's over. No question.
I want to come back to that point, but just before is we've mentioned it a few times, is the eldest son or child dies, Joe Jr. And they were close. They were close in age, right? A couple of years apart.
Yeah. Less than 2 years.
How? I mean, it's hard. We've talked about it earlier about the tragedies and suffering and loss, but I mean, it was a hard one for him. I mean, like as would be expected. I mean, how much did this kind of impact him? I mean, death will impact people in different ways, especially if you're close, a sibling. But how much do you think it impacted him?
I think it impacted him a lot. The Kennedys are, all of them, or certainly most of them, are restrained, if that's the right word, in terms of how they respond to tragedy, and they bottle things up to a degree. But it's clear from the evidence that we have that he took this really hard. The sibling rivalry had existed between the brothers. I argue in the book that it had become by this point more important for Joe Jr. than it was for Jack, because Joe was supposed to be the golden child. And yet, in various ways, Jack had begun to, exceed him in terms of his accomplishments. And I think that was difficult for Joe. But they were close, as you pointed out. I think when he went down, after the war really had turned, and it was pretty clear that the Allies were going to win, after Joe had the opportunity to come back to the United States, he had really served his tour, so he didn't have to do this. And then it turns out to be kind of a meaningless or inconsequential mission that he was on, kind of suicide mission. It was so dangerous. All of that, I think, was difficult for Jack as the next in line, and as they had played together since they were little. They're about 2 years apart in age. Really tough, and he has to recover from that, and he becomes, to a certain degree at least, he becomes kind of the heir. And even if biographers and documentary filmmakers have made too much of this idea that it's Joe who says, "Okay, Jack, it's your turn," there's certainly something to this idea that he feels like he now has a mission to complete.
Yeah. So, after he gets home from the war, he decides to jump straight to the U.S. House of Representatives. So he decides to go into politics. So just one, I guess, quick point here in terms of, again, a broad view of this. So he's 30, right, when he gets elected to U.S. House of Representatives, 31 or something like that. He's around there.
He's 29 when 29. He runs. He turns 30 in his first year in Congress.
Yeah, so super young. And, as we've been talking about, I mean, he's had like a incredible life his first 30 years, right? He's had so much foreign experience, etc. And I guess it's how much did all of these experiences and then deciding and discovering the kind of politician he wanted to be, with this kind of balance of idealism and pragmatism, how much of that was early goings here, and then I guess you can give us a teaser of how that impacted, when he gets elected president as well. But just that whole kind of arc of this balance of idealism, but also pragmatism. I mean, I think he's seen as a kind of centrist type of, politician. So how does all this stuff incorporate?
Well, it's a big question.
Yeah.
And an important question. There's no doubt that there's a mix of both in the young congressional candidate, 1946. I mean, think about this.
Yeah.
Skinny 29-year-old, just back from the service, not feeling particularly good, not actually a very good politician, by the way. in that first campaign. He doesn't really know what he's doing. We can come back to that. But I think, based on his letters, based on his speeches, which, by the way, he wrote mostly himself in that first campaign, I think you see somebody who is this blend, as you say, of idealism and pragmatic realism. That he, I think, believes in politics, in the power of politics to transform lives, in the importance of government to create a more just society. I think his grandfather had preached that message, had to some degree lived that message, both grandfathers in some ways. And he had just been through this war and had seen the power of idealism in terms of what it brought the Allies, the Grand Alliance in the end. I think that was at least in part about that for him. But he also gets, and he's quite shrewd in this regard, he also gets that politics is about meeting people where their needs are. It's about, at least to a degree, bargaining based on mutual concessions. I think he sort of almost intuitively understands that it's pretty messy in many respects. It's murky stuff. It involves compromises. Some of them may be a little bit sordid, but that's how democratic politics works. I think they're both there. I mean, it's, as I said, a huge question, and that's just the beginning of an answer. But I think you see that in the young congressional candidate and then congressman. I think you see it in Kennedy as a senator. And you see it as a presidential candidate. This is the part of the story that I'm writing, as we speak, as he's ramping up for 1960 and entering the primaries in 60. In fact, I guess I would say this, maybe a final comment on this. Maybe it's a secret of his success as a politician. He had shortcomings as a human being. We can talk about that. And, he made mistakes as a policymaker also. But maybe a secret of his lasting success and his legacy is that he was a kind of blend, as I've been trying to describe, of an idealistic American and realistic sort of realpolitik practitioner at the same time.
Yeah, I think that resonates. That kind of based on reading the book and the things I know about him, that makes a lot of sense as well. He's a very interesting figure. So I guess on the House of Representatives piece, he kind of jumps straight to that. He doesn't do local politics. He doesn't run for city council. He doesn't do anything. And maybe that wasn't not everyone has to do it that way. But I guess why is that the entry point into politics, I guess, for him? And then when he's there, is he really committed? I think he does six years there. Is that right? Or is he just using this as a stepping stone? Or is he really invested in the work? Or is it just kind of like, okay, I'll do this. And then, this is building me up for, run for Senate. And then who knows after that? Or kind of how do we see his time in the House of Representatives, and why is that the entry point?
Well, I think it's the entry point because a seat opens up in the 11th district here in Massachusetts, which includes where I'm sitting today.
Oh, wow.
And it opens up in part, I think, quite clearly with Joe Kennedy's help. And it becomes available then for young Jack to run for this seat, and is often the case in Massachusetts politics and elsewhere for that matter. What really matters is the Democratic nomination. So if you can get that, then you're basically assured of victory in November. So everything went into getting the nomination, 46. As I said, he's not particularly effective. He is really good already with small groups. It's clear that he has a way to connect with people. That's interesting. Wins the nomination pretty handily for the Democrats to be the Democratic nominee. And then, of course, it's a cakewalk in the fall. And then, as you say, he has 6 years. I think he decides early on that this is too small a stage.
Mm.
I think he says to somebody or other, we're just worms. Those of us who are in the House, we're just worms. And he thinks, especially given his interest in foreign policy, that he needs to move to the Senate, if possible, ASAP. Some people suggest, well, you should go for the governorship of Massachusetts and you could win. But there again, I think he's thinking to himself, well, but foreign policy, I won't really be able to do much as a governor in that area. So I think he's biding his time. He's preparing for a Senate opening to happen. Then, of course, decides, huge gamble, to take on a mighty figure, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., a formidable political figure from a distinguished family. People are saying to Jack, what are you, crazy? Even you can't, the Kennedys can't beat the Lodges. But he wins this epic race. It was really fun to write about. It's a chapter in the book, The Race Against Lodge. He prevails in a very dark year for Democrats nationally. This is one of the few bright spots. His taking down of Lodge. And maybe this is more clear in hindsight than at the time, but even at the time, people said, this is a young Democratic star in the making, this young Jack Kennedy. And then, of course, 8 years later, he's elected president of the United States.
Yeah, I want to get to the Senate piece of things. I just wanted to ask real quick, in this, right before the Senate campaign, his sister dies, which we've alluded to earlier. And so, he has an older brother that dies. It's super hard. And then his sister, who he was very close to as well, she dies. How much was this, just, gut punch? I mean, how does this really, impact him as well?
Yeah, I think it's hard to exaggerate the effect that she was known as Kik's death has. And I write a lot in the book about their close relationship and how they were soulmates. And he could go to Kik with anything, and she could go to him. And, it's another plane crash, a different kind of a plane crash, but she is killed in 1948. And lots of evidence of this from Lem Billings and others about how for weeks thereafter he was a kind of zombie, and he was not able to really function very well at all, including meeting his congressional obligations. I think he found that difficult. His father had always preached the line, life is for the living. And I think, Jack Kennedy tried to live by that. And so little by little, I think he recovered from this. I think it left a hole in his heart that, never healed. But I think he decided life is for the living. And first Rosemary, in a sense, with the botched lobotomy, then Joe Jr., now Kik. I'm the last of this quartet, and I'm the last of the so-called golden trio that was Joe Jr., Kik, and himself. I'm the last to be alive. One conclusion, Xavier, that I think he drew from this set of experiences is that you gotta live each day as though it might be your last. I think that he lived by that in many respects for good, maybe in one or two respects, not so good, but I do think he took from this idea that life is capricious. You never know what's going to happen. And I'm going to live it to the fullest. That's, I think, a conclusion that he draws from this terrible development in 1948.
I want to ask you just 3 more bits here as we get to the end of the book and where you end the book, at least in 56. The first piece is, so I mean, we could talk about the Red Scare and communism and McCarthyism and all that stuff, and then obviously he has this Asian tour in 51 where he becomes close with his brother and sees kind of the rest of the world. All of that is super influential, but I do want to ask about the 52 Senate campaign, which you already start talking about. What made that campaign, as you expressed, he's running against a powerhouse. I mean, this guy is a titan within politics. I mean, he's huge. How did he do it? How is the campaign so good? Was it just this is a fresh face, he's young, he has experience, he, really good canvassing, grassroots, small groups? I mean, what the money piece? I mean, how much of this was so good that he won? I mean, the Senate is hard. Senate campaigns are hard, especially in primaries. So how did he do it?
This question is endlessly intriguing to me. I love this whole business, partly because I'm interested in politics myself. Bit of a political junkie, I guess. But I think he develops in 46 and then hones in 52 and then further elaborates in 60. Those are the three big campaigns. Obviously, there are re-election campaigns in there as well, but those are the three big ones. I think he develops a strategy which has several elements. Maybe most important of one is that you start earlier than your competition and you work harder than your competition. So with respect to 52, although you could say the same thing about 60 and you could say the following about 46 as well, but in 52, he begins already in 1949 and 50. Long before he declares, before he even knows whether he's going to run in 52 against Lodge, he begins to travel around Massachusetts, small towns, little hamlets, and the bigger towns, and then of course Boston, to give speeches to anybody who will have them. And if he speaks to 12 people or 18 people or 36, that's fine, because they're going to remember, they're going to tell their neighbors, and it might make a difference in the end. And I think that strategy. And of course, his wealth matters here because he can afford to travel back from Washington because he's a congressman. But he travels back every weekend, back and forth, and then has the means to traverse the state weekend after weekend. But I think that's critical, and I think that's a strategy he will use. I think he also comes to appreciate, even in 52, that television is going to be a game changer.
I was just thinking this, yeah.
His father, of course, had been a Hollywood mogul. We didn't talk about this, but his father had been big in Hollywood in the 20s, understood the importance of image, understood the importance of being comfortable in front of a camera. And I think Kennedy, already to some degree in 52, I write about this, and we'll certainly see this in 57, 58, 59, 60 as he's gearing up to run for president. He knows that television is going to be huge in terms of politics. And then maybe the last thing I'll say about this, I could talk about this for way too long, is I think he understands the importance of connecting with voters. And so, he develops a political style that speaks to voters where they are. He keeps his speeches short. He understands, I think, intuitively, that if you drone on too much, it's not good. You always want to leave him wanting more. But he can connect with voters, and you see this in various ways. One of the ways you see it is that the volunteers that he gets in all of these campaigns, people come out of the woodwork by the thousands, certainly in 52 and in 60, to help him get elected. That says something about how his capacity to connect with voters. But yeah, those are a few elements.
It's really hard. I'm trying to just think about him, but it is very hard to not see many parallels with Barack Obama. I mean, there are many, in this aspect. I mean, there's very
and they have there's a certain, people have talked about this. I'm far from the first, but there's a certain coolness that they both exhibit, a sort of cool grace. That doesn't sound quite right, but they have a certain persona that they share, a kind of self-deprecating wit, which I think in Kennedy's case was extremely important. But that both of them sort of bring to the table. There are differences between them as well, but one can see the similarities.
Just two more here is I want to ask about, obviously, I mean, people have written about this. I mean, it's a huge thing. There's a whole, I'm sure in the second volume, you'll get into this even more, but he meets Jackie, they get married, they have kids, all this stuff. And it seems like it's a very, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting, right? I think in the beginning you write about it that I think they really were fond of each other and obviously I think loved each other, but it seems to peak. And then all of a sudden we start seeing problems already. And I don't know if that was some of his womanizing. I don't know if that was some of his, he's very much on this trajectory. He's very goal oriented in his professional life, but I just kind of just give us the very brief overview. Obviously, I mean, again, there's really, really much ink has been spilled on their relationship, but just the overview at this period, 50, 54, whenever they meet, 50, I forget when they meet, but in the mid 50s and how that looks.
They marry in 53. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This is of course a complicated story, and it'll continue to be in the second volume. In many respects, I would argue they're a good match, and I think the affection between them is quite real. I think they have quite a lot in common. They both admire one another. In other respects, they're not a great match. And he was untrue to her from before the wedding, and he remained, he continued to cheat on her after the wedding. That's really difficult. Jackie sometimes said to people, including before the wedding, "Oh, all men cheat. That's just in their DNA. This is just what men do. My father did it. His father did it. But I don't think she was prepared fully for this. In other words, I think it was harder than she suggested it would be once it actually happened to her. And, this is partly, I think, what he had observed in his own parents' relationship. His father made no secret of his own sort of chronic serial philandering. In fact, on occasion would bring a mistress home. And this was for the older children who were old enough to understand what was going on. This must have been completely discombobulating. I mean, what the heck is happening here? But I don't want to attach too much importance to this because Jack Kennedy has to make his own decisions, and not every child of a philandering father, becomes one himself. So, I don't want to extend this too far, but it's a close bond in many respects, a problematic one in others. I think as time goes on, and especially in the last year, I think it becomes a better marriage toward the end. But it's an important part of the story, no question.
The last question I have for you is, I guess one of it's kind of like it's like when you watch like a movie and it's like a part one of two, and it's like, well, the ending never really feels kind of like an ending. So why did you, I guess, decide? I'm thinking of the recent Dune movie where people were like, "What happens? Why does it just end like that?" And it's like, well, there's a part two for the, there's another part coming.
Is that what it is? Because I had that question about Dune. All right,
did you?
No, I know.
Yeah, Dune is a very large book. It's about 900 pages, and so they decided to really get a lot of it. They wanted to do two films, which I think is right to do it justice. And there is a natural breaking point in the middle of the book, so that's why it kind of ends that way. The second half is much more intense and it's much more action packed. It's great. But why 56? I guess. I mean, this is I mean, you could have ended it right halfway because we know the end point. Why 56? I guess.
Well, I think it felt right to me in the end. I hope readers, who might read the book after listening to us talk today, I hope they'll agree. I felt that 56 is a natural break because it's a very exciting finale, if you will, to that volume. He almost becomes Adlai Stevenson's running mate in 56. Stevenson decides to open up the process, the selection to the convention itself. And young Jack Kennedy almost wins. And he comes out of, maybe more important ultimately, he comes out of that convention in Chicago 1956, as the bright star of the party, because this is the first convention that has had the networks cover the proceeding sort of gavel to gavel. So millions of Americans are seeing this young guy for the first time.
Yeah.
And the other reason I think to end the book there is that it's in the aftermath of that convention and of that election, which of course Stevenson goes on to lose for the second time to Eisenhower. It's then that Kennedy decides, I'm definitely going to run for president in 1960. And so the book concludes, as you know, with a perhaps apocryphal, but I think substantially nonetheless correct sort of vignette in Hyannisport at Thanksgiving 1956, when father and son sit around and discuss. And Jack offers all the reasons why he shouldn't run in 60, and the father offers the reasons why he should run in 60. And the book ends with young Jack, or not so young, but youngish Jack saying, well, Dad, I guess the only question is, when do we start? That's when the book ends. And so I thought it was a way then to set up the second volume. And some people have said to me that they get to that last line and they want to turn the page and see what happens next. And so I'm grateful for that. But the second volume then will be the race, the 4-year-long race for the presidency, and the 1,000 days in the White House and the assassination. That'll be the next volume.
Yeah, so I was going to say, just kind of leave us with what we can expect. So obviously you have the second volume, you have 7 years. I don't know if you'll do like kind of how some people do like an epilogue, and they'll say like what happens after, and people that live after him.
I do. I do need to do that to talk about his legacy and to offer a few larger observations.
But in terms of like his actual life, there's 7 years, but my goodness, there's so many things that happened. And obviously he gets reelected for Senate in 58, and then president in 60, and then the assassination. And there's just like maybe more stuff in those 7 years than there was in the 40 years or whatever.
I will confess to you here at the end of our time together, Xavier, will confess to you that there have been a few moments when I've thought, this probably should have been 3 volumes. Because, and then I would have had to break it differently, however. Then it would have been broken with maybe his election to the Senate, or I'm not sure where I would have broken it. So it's not going to happen now. But as you say, there's a lot to do here. I'm confident I can do it. I'm really excited about the project still. People say, oh, you must be so sick of this. But no, in fact, it's a joy to be able to work on this. I do wish the archives were open. I hope they will be soon, because I desperately need to get in there for some archival work. But in the meantime, onward, as they say.
Well, I guess all that says is that the second volume will be very large, and I like large books, so hopefully it will be 1,000 pager. So, okay. Well, the book is called JFK: Coming of Age in the American Century, 1917, 1956. Where can people find this, and where can people find you?
Well, they can find me at Harvard, and so easy to find on the web, either the history department or the Kennedy School. I have an appointment in both. I have a foot in both, and so I'm easy to track down. I don't have a social media presence per se, but I'm easy to find. And the book, your friendly neighborhood bookstore, and obviously all of the online retailers as well. It's now also paperback. So there's the hardback, the paperback, and then of course audio and Kindle. But I hope people read it. You've been very kind to have me on today. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Yes, thank you so very much. It was an absolute wonderful time with you, and just a blast being able to talk with you about him and about your fantastic book. I can't say enough thanks for you coming on and talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.